Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 95. Today's guest is Robert Calafiore. Hello. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is photographer Robert Calafiore. Robert Calafiore employs a hand-built pinhole camera to create large-scale, one-of-a-kind sea prints. The subject matter, currently either select pieces from a family collection of ordinary glassware or the nude male figure, is placed within a larger construction, a constructed stage set. It is then transformed by the unique recording characteristics of the camera's wide angle, the extended exposure, and the light-sensitive paper's recording abilities. Calafiore manipulates the still life to control the results, altering the saturation, color, density, and translucency of specific areas. His interest in process, traditional materials, and the reaction between light and chemistry, as well as the personal and universal stories told through everyday objects and intimate relationships, drives the work in his studio practice. Now, I first encountered Robert's work at the 2017 Medium Festival, and they are really the kind of images that not only grab your attention from across the room, they really stay in your mind afterwards. These prints are pretty big, several feet high, and the color is just out of this world. So they pull you in right away, but then the more time you spend with them, there's really a lot going on in the images. So I was pleased to get the chance to talk with Robert for today's show. I put a link in the show notes to Robert's website, and I encourage you to take some time to check out his image galleries there. But if you'd like to see his work in person, and I do recommend that, you've got a couple of opportunities in Connecticut. Through September 29th, 2019, the Expanded Field exhibition will be up at the New Britain Museum of American Art, and you can find some of Robert's work included in that show. And then on September 12th, 2019, the Hartford Art School will be opening its faculty exhibition, which Robert will also be participating in. There are links to both in the show notes, so if you'll be in the area, definitely check those out. Okay, let's get started then. Here's my conversation with Robert Calafiore. So how are you today?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's good. Good to be here.
Yeah. I was thinking about, whenever I talk to somebody for the show, I like to think about the first time that I saw their work. And obviously yours was at the Medium Festival. I actually, so you were one of the, lecturers, last year, right? I believe you were the second site lecturer last year.
I was really thrilled to be selected for that. And, I've attended Medium twice now, and both times were just such fantastic experiences. And Scott Davis and everyone involved is just so wonderful. So yes, Medium has been great to me.
Yeah. I remember when Scott was putting out the promotional materials for last year's festival, he had some of your images on like the cards and stuff. And yes. I remember I recognized them because they're very recognizable. And I don't think that I had met you the previous year. You were being reviewed the previous year, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So I remember seeing your work at the portfolio walk, and then when I saw the cards that he had made for for last year's festival, I was like, I know those. Were those from last year? Whose were those? And he said, oh, those are Robert Calafiore's. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. So, I mean, your work is really visually arresting, very striking. And I have to imagine that's a pretty common reaction that, like, when people see it for the first time, they're sort of really struck by the visuals of it, the brightness, the color. But I mean, I'm sort of curious how people usually, engage with it, especially first off.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And there's sort of two sides to it. It's kind of it's a bit of a double-edged sword there, because there is this immediate reaction, and lots of viewers are drawn to it because of those things you just talked about. So that really high saturation and the intense color and this sort of ambiguity of the image. Not everyone immediately identifies it. In fact, more people than I expect don't immediately identify it as being a negative. But they're more drawn into the quality of the light and where's the light coming from and how is this lit and why does this look this way? There isn't this immediate, besides photographers or most photographers who can see it like that, the broader audience doesn't. So there's that attraction to all those things with a large part of the audience. And then there's this other side of it where when you get deep into talking about the work, critiquing the work, there's this other side of it that starts to question, well, is this too decorative? There's that word, that really dangerous word in the art world. Or too beautiful, another really dirty word in the art world now. And I'm really interested in both of those things. And I think I pushed the work to be even more of both of those things in response to that. And I think I have a lot more to do there, to kind of question those two things and how they fit in and their relevance today, particularly in art making.
That's really interesting. It would not have occurred to me to refer to your work as decorative. That's just not, it is the kind of thing that, as you say, is sort of a dirty word in art circles. Is that like an actual thing that, I could imagine if someone isn't very sophisticated in their engagement with images, that they might not be able to see past the surface of the image or past the immediate sort of visual surprise of it. But I would have thought that someone who, like a gallerist or a critic or something would be able to, see that there's more going on. But maybe I'm giving people a little too much credit.
It hasn't been a lot of people, but, as an artist, you get very caught up in sometimes just a few words and what one or two people might say versus the other 100 that are saying something completely other, right? Mm-hmm. So it hasn't been a lot of people, but I think just enough that it's pushed me in a direction to really investigate why or what those things might mean that I might not have been thinking about. Because like you, I don't see it that way either. The work to me is so much about what it's about.
Right.
That it's never stopped short of all those other things for me. So it's never just been about the surface, but about so much more. So like you, I immediately get beyond that. And I love the fact that that's what can bring the audience initially to the work. If you can see it from across the room or whatever your first experience with it is, and that's what draws you in, fantastic. I'm more than satisfied and happy with that. I love that visual impact that it has.
It's a funny thing. And the thing that you were just saying, how that response, even if it only came from a few people, has sort of prompted you to sort of lean further into it. I think probably a lot of people, especially if they were, sort of more at the beginning of their career, like you've been doing this for a while, so it's a little different. I think once you've been doing it for a while, you get a little more confident. But I know, like for myself, when I had gotten that criticism leveled at my work, and in my case, this was very early on, and it was completely apt. It was correct to say the pictures I were making were sort of merely decorative. But, I think a lot of people would take a criticism like that and say, well, what am I doing wrong? And sort of move away from it. I think this idea of pushing further into it, that's really interesting, especially because I agree that, contemporary art and especially contemporary photography does sort of have this aversion to certain forms of expression, to things that are overtly beautiful or things that could be, leveled the charge of sentimentality against them, or certain kinds of visual aesthetics that are more, that grab you more. And I find that a really interesting sort of thing to pull apart,
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And I've thought about that a lot. And, I work at an art school and I'm surrounded by both an undergraduate and a graduate program in photography. So there's a lot of talk and discussion and work being made around me. And I have colleagues of course, who are out in the world making work. And this comes up a lot. And I'm right there with you. I think there are many ways to use the photographic medium to express ideas. And I think in the art world, for some time, there's been a slightly narrower space for photographers to enter. And I think I leaned into those ideas about beauty and decoration even more for myself to help expand that space a little bit more. You know, I grew up in photography in the 80s. So the people I was looking at are people like Cindy Sherman and Sandy Skoglund and Jerry Yulesman and Dwayne Michaels and the Starn twins, Doug and Mike Starn. A lot of experimental work and a lot of work that was about, like Sandy, like building things, or like Cindy, you know, putting herself in these situations that were controlled and created. And so I think I come out of that kind of thinking and making, and although there's some of that going on now, I don't see enough of it, or I maybe just am missing it. I don't know. But so when those discussions come up about my work, I definitely think even more about them and push deeper into figuring out how I can maybe convince those others about a broader variety of ways of using photography, making pictures.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I feel like, you know, and I've said this to a bunch of different people on the show before. I think that we are at something of a turning point in photography. I think maybe the last 10 or 15 years, perhaps, that the sort of dominant aesthetic in contemporary art photography has really been sort of the deadpan. And
yes.
I mean, there's a lot of deadpan work that I really appreciate and just adore, but I find it really interesting because I think, you know, in the past maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe a little more, I'm starting to see more people sort of pushing back against that, making work that doesn't look like that. And I find it a really sort of fascinating and exciting time for the medium.
Me too. I absolutely have been experiencing that as well, and been so fortunate in the last several years to get out a lot more than I had been in the past, and to get my own work out and have it be a vehicle for interacting with some amazing photographers across the country, and meeting and getting to talk to them about their own work as well as mine, and hearing this conversation you're talking about going on more and more. And many of those people I've met at Medium.
Yeah.
Yeah. And through shows that have come together because of Medium, and a number of other portfolio reviews that I've attended and been involved in. I've had some incredible support. I have to say the photo community has been incredibly welcoming. And there have been a number of key people who have had a lot to do with the exposure my work has now received and the opportunities that I've been given to get the work out and to push ahead and make new work.
Yeah. The more I look at your work, the more sort of drawn in I am. But I feel like there's a lot going on in it. And especially when I actually kind of think both of you, so you've got two ongoing series. One is figurative work and one is still life. And they're both using this same sort of technique where you're using a large pinhole camera. You're shooting direct to paper, making unique C prints. I feel like both of these series have this really explicit connection to history and art history in particular, that the more I think about it, the more I find it really fascinating. And so this starts with your figurative work, which these are all male nudes, and
yes.
And first of all, there are so, speaking about art history, the male nude is so much less of a thing or less common in art history, especially recent art history. I mean, I guess there was more of it in sort of the Renaissance period, but recent art history, contemporary art history, like there's just so little of that. And this choice to present these figures in these positions that are very reminiscent of sort of the classical odalisque is, I think, a really interesting choice. And can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Art history has definitely influenced the way I think about making this work, and especially the kind of disappearance of the male nude. And you're absolutely right that I have looked back at the Greeks and the Romans and then come up into the Renaissance and the way the male nude was used in art making, portrayed in art making. I've looked at that a lot, but then it really kind of does disappear, and there's so little of it now in contemporary work. And you really have to question why, and then I had to question myself as to why or what I would want to do by photographing the male nude. And to me, it was pretty simple. This idea of, and this is not a new idea, it's been dealt with by other artists and writers and, in movie making, but the idea of, what is male and what it means to be masculine and how we identify ourselves. And that's all tied into my growing up and who I am and what I experienced. And I just wanted to very simply, without fanfare, make beautiful images of male nudes and really focus on the male body as an object to be desired, to be studied, to be looked at, and to see how I might be able to present it differently than it has been in the past, but with ties to that past. So there are a few ties. There's, in the photographic history, the use of the pinhole camera, the sort of simplest form of making a photograph, but then also that nod to the odalisques and the sort of poses that are normally reserved for the female figure. This kind of sort of vulnerability that the figures are placed in, these male figures are placed in, normally not seen. So yeah, it's that's where it started. Yeah.
I mean, and I even, thinking about the way that male nudity was portrayed in classical and Renaissance art, it really a lot of times still is, like it could be perhaps, I suppose I didn't go to school for art, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm not super articulate about these kind of things. I think that there's definitely a way that classical and Renaissance nudes sort of revel in the physical beauty of the subject, that we shy away from that with male figures now. But I think even looking at those classical and Renaissance male nudes, a lot of times they're still shown in very sort of powerful, oftentimes they're sort of a martial figure, even if they're nude, they might be like nude, but just wearing a helmet or something like that. Right.
Right. It was absolutely about strength and power.
Yeah. And this is something that you're definitely working against here by having these, subjects be in these positions that are very explicitly vulnerable or soft. I find that, I find it really refreshing, and especially because right now there is a really important conversation that we're, I think, sort of struggling through as a society about the nature of masculinity and what it means and what the consequences of our depictions of masculinity are. And thinking about how these photographs sort of play into that, I think that's really, I think that there's something good happening there,
I hope so. I hope that the images can be a conversation starter there. They're not the only images like this being made, but definitely that's what I've been thinking. And I think it's a really crazy time, a really interesting time that we're living in, but a really crazy time too, because we'd been making some really great progress in this area and in a lot of other really difficult subjects. But there's this weird shift that's happening, kind of turning back the other direction. And I'm really thinking about that, and I'm really thinking about how the work can help put us back on track, to allow for men to be something other than killing machines. I once read, and I can't remember where this came from, and I'm sure that people listening will be able to figure it out, but I once read about how little boys are, from the earliest age, by all of us, by not just other men, but by our mothers, and sort of seen as needing to be strong, and we have to prepare them to be able to go off into war, do battle, and kill. And that really struck me very early on, that the need for us to build men who can separate themselves from their emotions, who have what it takes to go out into a field and kill other men. That's really hard to wrap my brain around, that's one of the reasons men become who and what they are. Now, of course, not all of us go out into battle and into war, but there's this whole sort of way we raise men to think about themselves and to be able to completely separate themselves from their emotions so that they go off and do those things. And I can't remember where I read it, what article, and I'm not doing it justice, but that really stuck with me.
Yeah. I don't know if this is the thing you're thinking of, but there was a similar thing that was brought. There was this really great podcast series by Scene on Radio that is called Men, and it's all about sort of the history and consequences of our concept of masculinity. Probably what it is just that one of the people that they had on there talking about that might have been the person who wrote the thing that you read.
Probably.
Yeah. It is a really fascinating idea, and how that permeates everything. It's pretty profound once you come up against it. It's one of those things that, once somebody points it out to you, you start seeing it in everything. It really sort of reshapes the way that you see our whole society. And so, I certainly, for me in my own work, trying to, as an artist, make work that engages with, softer emotions as a man is something that's very important to me, like making images that feel tender or making images that feel, more emotional. That's something that I always am trying to do with my images. But I think that, even just in my role as like a parent or as a husband or something like that, that is also something that's on my mind a lot. I do think that, I don't know if art can change the world, but I do think that art can change a person. So having these, having work that is asking these questions and doing it in a way that isn't like beating you over the head with it, I think that can be it can provide a powerful experience for an audience member who's ready for it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think, I think you're right on there in the way I think. I don't want to beat people over the head with it. I want the images to bring you in many different ways, but ultimately to take you to that place where you can have that conversation. I'm always so surprised at an exhibition opening or when the figurative work is being shown, how many people find it difficult to look at or talk about those particular works still. It's amazing to me how sort of tense certain people can get around the work, or when you engage them in conversation about the work. It's really surprising to me that still in nearly 2020, it's hard for a man to look at another naked man.
Yeah. I mean, there is, I mean, and this isn't, it's not separate. It's part of the same thing, but this way that we also have this very strongly internalized homophobia, I think, is something that also plays into that tension. You know, it's like, I don't know, like the fact of being in the same room as an image of a naked man, is that going to make me gay? It's like, and as you say, it's like, it's almost 2020. I mean, how are we still having these conversations? And yet these things are buried so deeply and so pervasively in our society and in the ways that we were raised and in the ways that we conceive of ourselves that, I mean, rooting them out is a long process and a difficult one, you know?
Yeah, it's obviously taking a long time, and the conversation continues and continues and continues, and you question sometimes if we're even making any progress. But yes, I understand it's really complicated, and at the same time, sometimes I get in a room with my work, or I get in the room with a model, and I just think, why is this so hard? Like, why do people have such a hard time with this? You go to the movies and watch 1,000 people die on screen and come out and have really no question about it or no that. But you see one penis and you freak out.
Yeah. Yeah. I do, you know, I could keep talking about this body of work I've got so many other things that I could talk about with it, but I also want to make sure that we talk about the glass work. And because I was really taken by the story that you told in your Medium lecture. And then there was just recently, I'll link to this in the show notes, you did a video interview with Photo Relevance talking about your work, touched on some of the same things about the genesis of this still life work that you've been doing for the past, 10 years or so?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I think the listeners would probably like that. So, like, can we talk about how that came about?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it really it also, in part, has driven the figurative work too. Like you said, there's so many layers to that work, and it's not just about the nude male. There are many other layers, and I think we can touch on a lot of that here in the glass work. But the work I started because I've been teaching as an adjunct in photography for a long time, and over that 2 decades, I started noticing something, and it was happening simultaneously with lower enrollment at art schools and kind of questioning the value of the arts and art education and all those things. And what I noticed was, in a very simple assignment where 20 years ago I could hand an instruction sheet out and say, build a pinhole camera and come back in 2 days, and we're going to use this to make pictures. And those cameras, it was really easy. Those cameras would come back and they'd be 99% light, tight, functioning, no problems. And as the years passed, they started coming back less and less functional, and I had to give more and more instruction about how to make this simple, light, tight box. And I got really curious about that, and flash forward, 20 years later, and I do that now. And if I don't give the kind of instruction that I need to now, what comes back is this kind of alien baby, not a pinhole camera, but something that's not light tight in any way. And I realized, obviously, that this had to do with a student's dexterity. It was really simple for me. I was thinking about how I saw athletes in a ceramics class working early on in the introduction courses, and their understanding of their own bodies and how to use their bodies in the physical world and the material they were working with, the way they transferred their skill of hitting a ball to a lump of clay on a wheel and managing that lump of clay. And the athletes had a better understanding of the physical world and materials and how to interact with them. And what I noticed in my photo classes was there started to be a lack of that more and more every year. So to hold down a ruler and cut a straight line, or even to understand what measuring meant, what a fraction of an inch was, how to hold two pieces of cardboard together and at the same time simultaneously tape them together so they were at a 90-degree angle and tight against each other. it started fascinating me. So I just looked at it more and more closely. And of course, technology is what's being implicated here. I went out into the world and had a physical relationship with it through play, through work, through lots of things, through relationships. But the students growing up now have a completely different relationship to that world. It's two-dimensional. Much of it is bowling is sort of swiping your finger across a flat screen, not picking up a 15-pound ball and launching it down a 30-foot alley. So the relationship they have to physical materials, to their own bodies, to each other, to understanding the space they're in, all of that has shifted so enormously as to cause a change in the way they can handle material and even think about material. And so that's kind of what turned my attention to the pinhole camera. I hadn't been making work with the pinhole camera in any significant way until then. And I thought, okay, I want to turn my focus to this really simple object and what I can make it do, and how much can I get out of this thing, and how much can I labor over it. The harder it was, the more interesting it became for me, because it meant solving more and more problems as I started to create a large body of work. The question was, what was I going to make work about? So the interest is here, the kind of catalyst, the concept is there. How is technology changing our interaction to our physical world and the way we do things? What subject was I going to photograph? And I'd been collecting this glass work, these glass pieces from my parents and other family. My parents came here in the 40s from Sicily, classic immigrant story with nothing. And some of the first things they bought are the things that I have now coveted, and simple everyday objects like glass plates and bowls and compotes and the things that we took out for company, those special things that didn't cost a fortune and were highly designed, mid-century modern design, and the quality of material used, and all those things I zeroed in on, and I made this collection of glass work, which really represented my family and where they came from and their struggle and the opportunities they were given when they came through immigrating to the U.S., and the life that it gave us, me, my two brothers, my sister. So the subject became this glassware, and it really takes the place of us. They're really portraits in a lot of ways. That's where it all started.
I mean, there's the thing that I love about this glassware work. First of all, I mean, again, it is very beautiful, and it's also pretty abstract. Like, you could come up to these images and not immediately know what it is that you're looking at, which I find that's also an interesting, like, it's an interesting technique to use when it's something that is very, like, it's a concrete object and it means something specific to you. Also, like, when you do look closer at it, when I look closer at it, and recognize the objects, it does sort of bring me back to, for me, it was like my grandparents' generation. You're a little bit older than me, but not a lot older than me. But, I remember going to my grandparents' house and seeing, like, candy dishes or things that look very similar to these things, right? Or all of their friends would have them as well. And I think this tie to the past is sort of fascinating, especially in light of the tools that you're using. You know, like, you're using a very simple, like, going back to even, you know, what you might call pre-photographic camera obscura kind of techniques. That's a very historical process. You know, even now, like, using direct paper C prints, that's not like a thing that was very common when C print technology was created, when it first invented. But I mean, nowadays, how many people make C prints at all? It's if you see prints at all, they're usually inkjet prints, I feel like.
Yes.
And so tying this personal history to the sort of sense of photographic history, I think that's interesting. It's interesting to me anyway.
Yeah, no, me too. And it's definitely intentional. The work started there, but the abstraction you're talking about, to cover a few things you mentioned, the abstraction you're talking about is definitely a layer of the work and an interest of mine. I'm very process oriented, very much about the material and what I can get out of it. And then the abstract passages that happen in the work, whether you can identify the things in them, and sometimes it's easier than others, is not necessarily important. There's so many layers in the work. The abstract passages, there's some little parts of them that are just stunning. I still stand at the processor at the chemistry baths, and when a print emerges, when an image emerges, it's like the first time I've ever seen it happen. It's so exciting, and there's so many wonderful surprises, things that I'm not expecting. And that's part of the excitement for me and wanting to make more work. Then there's that personal, universal story. They're really personal to me because these objects belong to my family. But like you, oftentimes audience members can identify certain pieces or similar pieces that they've seen or have a story about. So this sort of personal, universal. And even if you didn't grow up in the 60s, and 70s, we've all used cups. We've all had candy dishes. And so there's this really great universal storytelling ability that I love about the work too. And then the nod to photographic history here with a real respect for and homage to people like Talbot and so many others. But the shelved glassware that you see in Talbot's articles of glass and articles of china, certainly thinking about that work when making this work. And to reference even outside of photography, I've always been fascinated with Matisse. And there was that really fantastic show last year in Boston called In the Studio, all about Matisse, and focused on the objects that he painted over and over again, and how they traveled with him and what they meant to him and how they took on this whole other life in the work. But the repeated action of painting or looking at or studying or engaging with the same objects over and over and over again, all of that really fascinating to me, and a big part of the work.
Yeah. To me, I also, and this is sort of similar with the figurative work as well. Like I also notice a pretty strong classical influence to it, or maybe not classical is not the right word, but like, I want to say Catholic. I mean, a lot of the ways that these things are framed, they remind me of like a cathedral or like a reliquary or something like that. And I know your recent show at Photo Relevance was called Glass Relics. So it seems like that must be in there. I know also, looking through some of the earlier work that you presented at Medium, which I took some time to look through again recently, that sort of, I don't know, Roman, or, church-based iconography or aesthetic seems to be very present in a lot of your early work, and present here as well. Would you say?
Oh, for sure. And I really appreciate that. I think it's a fantastic observation, and others have made it. But absolutely, I grew up Roman Catholic, and I spent so much time in those kinds of places as a kid, and had the great fortune of being able to travel to Italy with my parents as a young child, very impressionable 5, 6, 7-year-old kid, standing in these grand architectural spaces, most of them religious based, and some of them, of course, going way back to Roman and even earlier Greek times. Sicily has some of the best preserved temples in the world. And I've experienced those places as a little kid. Not that many times, because it quickly grew far too expensive for my parents to take us there in the summers, but a couple times. And that's all burned, etched into my brain. Those experiences with, I think my work, if I had to sort of broadly talk about it, I think over and over again about my relationship to space and to people, at the sort of in its most sort of basic form, it's always about those experiences. So yes, for certain, these are about my studies of, what am I doing sitting in church for 45 minutes? Probably not listening to everything that's happening. But as a, very young creative, I was always making and doing, and I was fixated on the interiors, the statuary, the niches with all their little objects in them, the kind of importance that we gave things. This work kind of, for me, is this transforming of the ordinary to the extraordinary. Even in the figurative work, there's always a little bit of that going on. And I think it comes from what you're talking about. It comes from those experiences, those religious experiences in spaces, this kind of weight that we give objects and the power they can hold. So they kind of become, the whole is more than the sum of all its parts. What that little saying is, and I think that's where that part of the work comes from. I think you're right on.
Mm. Well, why don't we take a quick little break, and then we can come back and do the second segment.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So it does sort of relate to the work in a lot of ways. And being in art education, there's sort of two things that I thought would be interesting to talk about. And it's the sort of continuing demise of art education, not only in this country, but it seems to be seeping out into other parts of the world. I always thought of European education having far more focus on the arts and valuing the art. And I think that's true, but I think it's even beginning to really erode in that part of the world as well. And I'm not familiar with every part of the world in arts education, but certainly in the US and Europe, there's so much being talked about right now. And the impact of that decline, the impact it's going to have on other disciplines. So I have started really studying that. And there's some really interesting things to talk about, I think. And then tied in with that is the sort of de-skilling of our younger generations, and specifically in art making. And I know it's a touchy subject. Look, I'm not here to say that, bringing strong conceptual ideas to art making is the wrong way to go. You absolutely, in my opinion, have to marry. It has to be a beautiful marriage between great ideas and observations about our world and who we are and where we've been and where we're going and how that can help us talk to each other and so forth. That has to be married with some kind of skill. For me, I think we've maybe lost sight a little bit about that part of art making, or at least that portion of the population who wants to make work that way. It's sort of been brushed aside. And it's not just in art making, though. That de-skilling is across disciplines, and it's leading to a lot of really interesting things. So to get the conversation going, to point out a few of them, I read an amazing article that talks about how this came out of England, that talks about how very young students can no longer hold pencils and write the way we do because the muscles in their fingers are changing because of the way they use technology. That's amazing to me. That evolution, if you project out that evolution and what it might mean for being human in the future, this is what fascinates me. Like, what will it mean to be human in the future? There are certainly a lot of studies going on and a lot being written about it, but that's one example. And then another is how I've heard more and more in the medical world how students have the academic wherewithal, but their dexterity, their lack of tactile knowledge then gets in the way. So you have a surgeon who has all the academic prowess, but can't stitch, can't, imagine someone who can't move their fingers in a way that they could stitch you closed in an operating room. And maybe that will change too. Might be, machines that will be doing that in the future. But I guess my interest in my conversation here is, what do you think? What do other people think about what's happening? Where are we willing to let technology take us? When does it stop being positive, maybe?
Yeah, it's funny. So you and I are both, I think we're both Gen Xers. I know I'm like on the very young end of the Gen X spectrum, I guess, the age range.
I'm on the tail end of the baby boomers, 1 year off of the boomers.
So I guess we're at opposite ends of the same sort of notional generation. I only bring that up just to say that, I can relate to people my age. There's a lot of people talking with different levels of, in different ways about the younger generations, about millennials and the ones that came after. And to some degree, I think that this sort of question, right, is very, cyclical. I think to some degree, these questions about what the world is going to be like when the younger generations, take over. Mm-hmm. I think that this is sort of like an eternal sort of anxiety of the human condition, because when I think back to when I was a teenager, right, I just turned 40. And, I'm in that period of my life where I'm, thinking a lot about the future, but also about the past. I think it's very common when somebody hits 40.
Yes. I did that 10 years ago.
So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about, I remember being in high school and how when I was in high school, the people that were my parents' age at the time wrote a lot of articles about, what are these kids going to be like when they grow up? It's like the world is ending kind of thing. And largely that hasn't, the world might be ending, who knows, but it isn't necessarily because of what we did. So the question for me is if this is different now, then why is it different? So to begin with, I'm not sure it is. Because like I say, I think that, when I go back and I think about my own childhood, when I think about how people talked about the baby boomers back in the 60s, when I think about how people, at every generation, there's the older generation sort of, getting nervous about this kind of thing and what it means. What is it going to mean for the future? What is the future going to look like? I think that that's a very natural
Absolutely.
Sort of impulse.
Yes, especially around technological revolutions, right? And this is, maybe you could consider this the fourth, I guess. And I hear what you're saying 100%. And I agree. It's definitely cyclical. I guess I'm questioning whether there is something different, like you're saying, about this time around. I don't know. I don't think I'm saying good, bad. I'm not trying to make that kind of judgment call. I'm just really interested in where we're going. What will it lead to? Are we interested in that place? Are we just going to sort of let it happen? Do we question what those things are? Do we want those things to happen? And I guess you're right. That's always been the case, but there's something about augmented realities, artificial intelligence that seem just so different to me than the kind of changes that have occurred in the past that we're talking about in terms of cyclical change and looking back.
No, and I agree. I think there might be something different about right now. But so the question to me is, what is different? But, just to sort of talk about that a little bit, I think that change is one of those things that's inevitable. I feel a certain anxiety about, here are the things that were valuable to me in my youth and that are valuable to me now that have made me who I am. And so the idea that some of these things won't continue does certainly produce a fair amount of anxiety in me. So I can definitely relate to that impulse. I tend to be a little bit of an optimist that, like, I think there are some things about human nature and human interaction that even though the form of it might change, that there's something essential that will continue. You know, like if we go way back, there's this really great story that I just reread recently. I read it the first time a few years ago, and then it's by Ted Chiang, and it's called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling. And he's sort of it's a science fiction story. And he's sort of comparing this sort of near future scenario where everyone is constantly recording video of their whole lives, and you know, through like retina projectors, and so that you can constantly see it in this artificial, you know, augmented reality kind of way. And the thing that's really brilliant about this story is that while he's sort of examining, you know, this new technology, new to us, doesn't exist yet, and how that would change, you know, our approach to memory, how that would change our cognition, these things. At the same time, he's comparing it to, he's writing a parallel story about a pre-literate society in Africa, I think, that when European missionaries first come and introduce writing to their society, and how writing is also a technology, and writing is a technology that completely changes the way that you interact with memory, the way that you interact with language, the way that you think, and how that was also for this pre-literate society, this oral society, how that seeing that happening was also a source of anxiety. And yet most of us would say that on balance, yeah, maybe we lost certain things when our culture developed writing or was introduced to writing. But on balance, we still think like, well, we're still human. And also what we gained from it was
big gains.
You know,
right.
It's certainly an open question whether that is going to be true of the technologies that we're seeing developed now. But like I say, I tend to be a little bit of an optimist when it comes to human nature.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I tend to be less of an optimist. And that's good. You know, obviously, that's why conversations like this get to come up, and we get to help each other see through things differently. For me, I'm trying to imagine that future, and that's really exciting. Is as exciting as it is maybe anxiety inducing. I won't be around to see it, right? So I don't have to be that anxious about it, but it's really interesting to me. And what will it mean to connect it back to, you know, what will it mean to how I will make work, or what I will think about making work about, and so forth. That's exciting, I guess, but it just seems like in talking to so many people around me, there's this feeling that something is different. And I guess, you know, that you keep saying that. So I guess that's the real important part, or the crux of this conversation, is defining what is different. I don't have an answer. That's really the question here, I guess. And that's what I have to turn my attention to then, after this conversation.
Yeah.
Is how can I maybe define for myself, not for others, but for myself, what is that difference? Why do I feel like it's different?
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you what, I do think that there is something different, but I tend to think that it has a little bit less to do with technology and more to do with economics. This is like something that I've just recently been thinking about. So my opinions might not be very well articulated or well formed, but like, you know, cause this was actually something that you mentioned the thing about your students and how their sort of manual skills, had sort of deteriorated over the years, not like in individuals deteriorated, but like the quality of, you know, each incoming classes, manual skills,
right.
Sort of slipping over the years. And I certainly can't argue with that observation, right? Like that's a true thing that you've observed in your students, right?
Oh yeah. And it's pretty well documented across lots of, areas and places. Yeah.
Yeah. What I think is to me, I mean, I think technology must play a role certainly in how we, technology in a lot of ways mediates the ways that we experience the world. But the question for me is always like, well, who has access to these technologies? Because not everybody does. When I'm thinking about, some of the examples that you've brought up are students who are attending an art school or students who are attending a medical school. These are people who, and it's not going to always be this way, because there are people who get scholarships and there are people who sort of, bootstrap their way up. But by and large, people who are going to medical school and art school tend to be from a more affluent background. Would you say that's fair?
That's probably still pretty fair to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that to me, when I think about, like, I'm even guilty of this with my own kids, right? Like, when I was growing up, my mom worked 3 jobs for a long time. And even when she was down to just one job, she was working constantly. And, when I was a kid, we lived in rented houses that we had roommates, we didn't have our own place. It was like me and my mom and my brother and also 2 of my aunts living with us. So it was like we came from a thing where we couldn't afford to do things like hire people to clean our house, right? And so consequently, like, my brother and I and my mom would do all of the scrubbing. We would do all of the, laundry. We would do all of the everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's like, probably you and I are similar in that way.
Familiar, yeah.
But when I think about my own kids, right, like, I'm in a much more financially comfortable position myself now than my mom was when she was my age. And certainly when, like, the age I was when my kids were born, my mom, who was a single parent, like, didn't have that kind of financial stability at that age. And, like, we do have someone who, can come in, we don't have like a maid that lives with us full time, but we have someone who comes like every 3 weeks and, scrubs our, kitchen sink or whatever. Right. So it's like, yep. That's something that my kids have literally never done. They've never, like, been on their hands and knees with like a bottle of Comet and a sponge and, like, been like trying to clean the mildew out of the bottom of a shower. That's just like not something they've ever experienced. Right. So they probably wouldn't even know where to begin. That's not because they're young. It's because I've never made them do it, because I'm a lot wealthier than my mom was,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have to wonder how much that plays into it,
I of course, that has to be a big part of it, right? And I guess that's the interesting part then, sort of looking forward to see how that will continuously change and where it will take us and how that shapes who we are and what we are.
Yeah.
I guess maybe to get more specific, how will, if we stick to the technology idea here, how will it continue to cross over with the human body, and how much technology will be integrated in being a human being, like flesh and blood human being? It's a little sci-fi, right? Maybe. But you can't help but imagine that. And it's coming. It's already
to some degree it's already there, right?
It's already there. And I guess if you think about it as sort of just part of natural evolution, then it all makes sense, right? It's just, we are certainly completely different as humans than we were, and we will continue to evolve. And as technology intersects with that evolution in new ways, in different ways than it has in the past, then humans will continue to evolve into whatever they will become. That fascinates me. Yeah. And again, I have no opinion about, if it's good or bad, or their observations, and what will it mean to our future, I guess.
And something else that I often think about with the younger generation is because I do think that this is going to happen, right? I think that we're going to have like this whole thing about augmented reality, like eventually we've already got Google Glass. It's just a matter of time until someone invents something that like fits inside your eyeball or contact lenses or whatever, right? Like,
yeah,
that's going to happen. At the same time, you know, like how many people do you see walking around with Google Glasses on? Not that many. And it's mostly people who can afford it. You know, technologies do get cheaper over time, but there is always a separation, I think, economically between who can access these technologies and who can't. And what I find really fascinating is at the same time that these technologies are being developed and deployed, you also have in the younger generation, like the millennials, right? And and who knows what the millennials kids are going to be like, you know, cause like the oldest millennials are almost 40 now, so they're not kids anymore, right? But,
right.
but like, it is that generation that has seen like farmers markets and artisanal pickles and all the things that we make fun of them on Portlandia for, right? Like, this sort of like, you know, farm to table, like getting back to the earth thing. That is a millennial innovation, if you can call it an innovation to move backwards, but it's like a purposeful moving backwards, right?
Yes.
And
I kept craving for nostalgia too.
Yeah.
In there.
Yeah. And I think that's a really, like when you take that together, like that's a really fascinating dynamic where you have technology moving apace, moving forward, but then you also have at least some segment of the younger generation having like a very consciously moving backwards away from those technologies. I think that's really interesting. And to me, that's why I think I tend to be a little optimistic about human nature, because I think there's something playing there, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just about to interrupt you and say, yeah, hopeful. There's your optimism there. It's hopeful. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating. You know, I think it's really fascinating to think about. And I guess all I can do is react to the impact it's having on my life and the people around me now. Right. So, the way it impacts the classroom, the way it impacts, my nieces growing up, even with some older, friends, the sort of inability to focus for very long or stay engaged in anything for very long, all those things, the way it impacts me in the now, outside of thinking of the future, is also something I'm drawn to, or that I note a lot day to day.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I certainly can't argue with that. I have to cop to, you know, I don't usually sit down and watch a whole episode of television just looking at it anymore, even when I'm reading. And I've read almost 50 books this year. But even so, like I will often, you know, one of the things that I think is interesting about when I read now is that reading becomes this weird sort of like social thing. I'm not even sure social is the right word, but it's like a lot of times I'll be reading and I'll be very engrossed in what I'm reading. When I was a kid, when I'd read, I would sort of like get absorbed in my book to the point that 3 hours would fly by and my mom would be talking to me and I had no idea she was even in the room. That doesn't happen as much now, but what I do notice is that like when I'm reading something when I encounter a passage that I'm like, oh, holy shit, that was amazing. Like, then I'll want to tweet something about it, for example, right? I'll want to share that experience with someone else. That is not something that would have occurred to me in the past. I don't know what it means. And I do think that my attention span is arguably shorter than it used to be, but I don't know. It also, to me, sort of speaks to this desire for connection that people have, you know?
Yeah. I see that. I can see that. No, absolutely. I can see that. And, you know, we're talking about huge variances in the population, right? For all sorts of reasons. So, I'm not trying to stereotype or generalize.
No, I mean, no, I definitely think that social media has had some kind of effect on, you know, how we interact with the world and how we interact with each other. I think that's undeniable. But it is a question, you know, like, what does it all mean? Who knows?
Yeah, and it's no different. You're right. Everything always changes, and I'm all about change. Again, I'm in an art school, and we need to change constantly. We struggle with change. People struggle with change, and I'm always sort of at the front of the meeting, screaming for more change. So I'm all about it. I think it's really powerful and helpful and important to question that change and to direct that change and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Ooh, that's a big one. Yes, and it sort of ties right into what we're talking about. Do you know the work of Jordan Wolfson at all?
That name sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it.
I saw it for the first time maybe just a couple years ago, but there are a series of works, and before seeing them in person, I saw these little video snippets of them, and they're these, human-like robots. And the very first piece I saw, I can't remember the title of the first piece that I saw, but the video, the sort of document of the piece opens with a close-up on its face. And for a second or two, you're probably convinced that what you're about to see is a human performing. And you're in on the face. The face has a mask on, so it's really creepy, but it's the hair of a female. It's like long blonde hair. And as it pulls back, you hear the movement of the robotic arms and legs, and you start to realize, okay, it's not human, and it's talking, and the lips look real, everything looks real, and it's just saying, touch is love, and it continues to kind of ask you questions, close your eyes, tell them touch is love. And as it pulls back further and further, it's attached to a mirror and it's looking at itself. And it's attached to this mirror by this rod that comes out of its chest into the mirror that holds the thing up. And it's moving its legs and arms and blinking. And it's just talking about touch and love. And it alludes to all the things that I'm kind of for me, when I look at the work, it kind of alludes to all the questions that I'm sort of asking myself. What will it mean to be human in the future? What will a physical relationship be? How will I communicate with other people? What is love in the future? What is friend? What is family? What is anything that has to do with that in the future? And that work really struck me. So it's probably the work I've seen most recently that kind of left a real impact on me.
I think I might have seen one of those videos that you were talking about, like going around on social media a little while ago. And all I can think was that it was unsettling in a way that feels significant.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that sums it up. Very unsettling, and it does sort of make you stop and think for a minute. And again, to end with, that might not be the place that takes us. I'm not insinuating that is a negative place. It's just vastly different than where we're at. And I think thinking about it and questioning it and asking ourselves if it's where we want to be is not a bad thing. Yeah, definitely. Well, listen, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, me too. I really appreciate the opportunity and your support. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Once again, you can find some of Robert's work included in the Expanded Field exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art through September 29th, 2019. That's in New Britain, Connecticut. And Robert will also be participating in the Hartford Art School's faculty exhibition that opens on September 12th, 2019, with a reception from 4 to 6 p.m. There are links to both in the show notes, so if you're in the area, do check those out. And that is our show. If If you want to respond to anything you heard on today's show, or perhaps tell me all about your favorite artists and writers, you can find me and the show on Twitter and Instagram at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen, and as always, you can reach me via email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can also make my day by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, and you can support the show financially by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on September 11th with a conversation with fellow podcaster Helen Zaltzman, so do be sure to come back for that one. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.